It's over.
Well,
I can smile again.
You got an extra day. You can still file. If you haven't filed, you can file.
Yeah,
by
the
midnight
computer
tonight
went down
and
there.
not be late.
Antiquated computer system. I'm glad to hear the IRS has an antiquated computer system.
Yeah, T.S. Eliot said April is the cruelest month, and he didn't even probably refer to the fact that it was time we have to pay taxes.
But I'm glad I got mine done. That was a real cloud hanging over my head. I don't like that.
I made it to another extension.
God bless you, Bob.
But at
I
least,
couldn't take the pressure. I got to get
at
it
least,
out of
at
the
least
way.
we paid our minuscule share of the war machine and the. Oh, never mind.
It's all right.
It's
deficit spending. That's we
it's
don't need
over.
your taxes.
We don't need your taxes. Yeah.
Cut more taxes.
So here we are. We're going to have a great show tonight. We want to talk about Marsy's Law. And if you know what that is, we're going to tell you all about it and why, although on the surface it may seem appealing, when you look at it, it's really not. And Mike is going to try to poke holes in the argument of our guest who's here from the American Civil Liberties Union, New Hampshire.
Not an easy task, I think, but I'll do
Jeannie
my best.
Haruska, and we will be asking her to introduce herself very soon. But this week, as we have most weeks, I'm happy to say, my good friend Mike Farley has a POTUS report on the progress
Yeah,
report.
we're bringing it back. I stumbled a little bit, but we're back with the POTUS report. And as our regular viewers may know, this is an effort on my part to try to find the stories that aren't really blasting in the front of the headlines, but the stuff that's going on maybe at the second tier. And this is something that's been percolating for a little while, and I think it's important, and I think it's something that we all should keep an eye on going forward. I think it means something going forward. And this is a request by 3 Republican committee chairs in the House of Representatives to the Department of Justice, to Deputy U.S. Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, to turn over unredacted copies of the Comey memos that are in their possession and in the possession of the Mueller probe. Now, that request, it's coming from, I want to get this right, from the Judiciary Committee, Chairman Bob Goodlatte, Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes. We know he's the guy that ran over to the White House to bring them the paperwork that he got from the White House the night before. In other words, a real, right down the middle guy. And then the Government Reform Committee, Trey Gowdy. Those 3 chairmen requested this information. Rosenstein has requested additional information to provide these memos, indicating in his response that there is some classified information and that they're still working out the details of what they can release and what they can't release. But what's going on here, think about who the players are. This is Rod Rosenstein. He is pretty much the only guy that stands between Donald Trump and Mueller's investigation. Or
ending Mueller's investigation.
Well, that I think goes without saying because I think that's been in the press. So what we have here is kind of setting up a straw man. They've demanded something that they claim should be handed out like candy, out of hand without any consideration. Rosenstein is balking, and this I think may be an effort to set up a reason to fire Rosenstein, which could result in the domino falling and then getting to Mueller. So I bring that up. It's in the works right now. Rosenstein's response was sent over to the chairman only yesterday, and we'll see what happens. But I'm sure they're going to have something to say about it.
Very good. Very good. That is really getting into this at a level that I think many of our viewers will not have realized.
Well, I hope you like it. Respectfully submitted. But,
respectfully submitted. That is
I thought I had to do some work because I kind of did not get a report out last
you
last
didn't.
week, so
we
I
missed
thought I
it.
should make a little effort.
You did yourself proud this week, I may say. So we are going to talk about something that's very current, very important in New Hampshire. We are facing the possibility of amending our Constitution this fall, and voters have to amend the Constitution. It doesn't just take the Senate and the House, although it requires their doing their part by passing an amendment, a proposed amendment by a 60% vote, a supermajority vote in both houses, and then it gets on the ballot where it requires a 60% vote, right?
Two-thirds vote.
Two-thirds vote in the public, okay. And there are going to be at least, I think there's going to be at least one amendment on the ballot in this fall for you all to consider when you're voting for governor and everybody else in the Senate and the House and Executive Council and Congress, other than our senators. You're going to be asked to consider a constitutional amendment to restore taxpayer standing to the citizens of New Hampshire. I'm a big
Very
supporter of that,
important amendment.
and I'm happy to talk about that. But there's another amendment that's being proposed, and it's moving through the legislature right now. It hit a severe bump today, and it's called Marsy's Law. Now, we have with us a representative of the Civil Liberties Union, American Civil Liberties Union, New Hampshire chapter, and she's Jeannie Haruska, and she's the policy director there, right? Is that right?
That is right.
And we're very pleased to have her with us because she has lots of information and insight about this, but I hope you'll tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're here in New Hampshire and why you're working on civil liberties.
Sure. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm Jeannie Haruska. I'm the policy director for ACLU New Hampshire. I'm our chief lobbyist, so to speak. I handle all our legislative work at the State House. So while I have an office, I tend to basically live in the hallways of the State House and the Legislative Office building. On any given legislative session, we track about 150 to 200 bills, testifying on them, trying to push them one way or the other. But Marsy's Law has been a big focus of ours this session.
Is it the biggest this session, would you say?
It's our... Probably not. We have other priorities that we're trying to actively pass. This is probably our most concerning in terms of defensive legislation. That I understand we're going to get into Marsy's Law.
We will.
In my background, I'm coming from working at the U.S. Department of State, actually working in Central Africa for the last several years, working on democracy and human rights, trying to help countries in Central Africa have free, fair elections, uphold human rights. And what really motivated me to come work domestically was seeing how civil liberties were being violated across the country. And it's one thing when you're expressing...
When did you decide this was the problem that you wanted to concentrate on?
It started to occur to me when the uproar around Ferguson happened, when you start to see the array around racial justice. You start seeing the concerns about racial bias in the criminal justice system, and that's not new, but I think it's really encouraging that it's come to the forefront and that our country is really having to reconcile with racism and issues of race. And I think that's encouraging, and I wanted to be a part of that conversation domestically, because race relations here domestically really do impact our international standing.
I'm sure they do.
So,
and when did you decide to come back here, and why did you come to New Hampshire?
So I'm a New Englander. I was born in Massachusetts and raised in northern Vermont. So I always wanted to come back to Red Sox country, as I would say.
Well, that's everywhere now.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, as far south as New Haven, beyond there you got a problem.
No, I don't know. Go to Tampa and try to catch a ball game.
Yeah, I grew up with a father who said, "You don't know if the day doesn't begin until you know if the Yankees lost and the Red Sox won." So I'm excited to be back in a zip code where the local team is on TV every night, and I get to see the Red Sox and the Celtics.
Very good. How long you been here?
Since last fall.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, we're certainly glad you're in New Hampshire. We hope you stay for a long, long time.
I bought a house. I am here for the long term.
Well, that's wonderful. So why don't you introduce us to Marsy's Law? As I posted about this, I try and post about our show at least a few hours in advance of the show, and I posted, say, this is a law about, giving rights to victims of crime and giving them the same status as accused have in our Constitution, where you have all kinds of protections for the accused. Why shouldn't victims have the same kind of recognition of their rights in the criminal process? And you could start with that and then tell us what it really is about.
So let me just frame what Marsy's Law is kind of nationally. So Marsy's, the reason it has that name, this is an initiative out of California to put a very specific set of victims' rights into every single state constitution, with the goal of eventually changing the U.S. Constitution and putting in this specific formula for victims' rights. And I appreciate the way you introduced it, because our concern is that it's really a misnomer to equate victims' rights with defendants' rights. You're talking about two entirely different things. Defendants' rights are rights against the state. They are limits on government power. right? They prevent the government from arresting anyone at any time for any reason. I've worked in Central Africa where you see governments arrest protesters, opposition members, and throw them in jail, no trial, throw away the key, and you don't see them for months or
We've
years
got
on
a
end.
president that's talking about throwing people in jail without discussing a trial first.
Well, and thank God we have the Constitution, because that's really what it is. It checks the government. Defendants' rights are rights against the state. That's why they're in the Constitution. It's not because defendants' rights are somehow morally more important than victims' rights. It's because they serve that purpose. Victims' rights are often rights against the defendant. They're one individual's rights against another individual. They're not checks on the government. And so our concern...
There are actually obligations in some cases on the government.
Exactly. And our concern with Marsy's Law is the language is so expansive and so ambiguous, it's really hard to know how it will be implemented, what the impact will be. And it's easy to envision circumstances where a victim's right could conflict with a defendant's right. And in any circumstance where a victim's right would win out and where a defendant's right would lose, what you're really doing in that instance is strengthening the hand of government, right?
Well, you know, the defenders of Marsy's Law, and I've certainly been to hear their case, would say that they are very determined that the Marsy's Law rights would not in any way compromise or diminish the rights of the accused, who are, after all, presumed innocent until convicted and proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
I would note two things on that. One, it's impossible to know that for sure because the language is so expansive and so ambiguous. It's really hard to know how these rights will be enforced. And I understand that the proponents say the goal is not to impede defendants' rights. That's great that that's the intention, but we don't know how this is going to get interpreted by courts. Mm-hmm. And there are rights in Marsy's Law that are easy to see conflicting with the defendant's right. Victims would have the right to a prompt conclusion of the case. What if that conflicts with the defendant's need for more time to develop their case? You can see those rights conflicting.
Good point.
Well, we have speedy trial requirements in our Constitution currently to protect defendants from languishing in jail while their case awaits trial, but the defendant can waive that if it's in his interest.
Well, that's one of the arguments that the Marsy's Rights group makes, is that the defendants often get continuance after continuance after continuance, to get a different lawyer or whatever, and this is unfair to victims like those who would be protected by Marsy's Law.
So, retired New Hampshire Supreme Court Justice Carol Ann Conboy testified in front of the House committee last week and addressed that and said judges are very aware of the need to kind of move cases along, and they're very aware of the fact that victims want cases wrapped up. Judges are used to balancing these interests. When a defendant asks for a continuance, it is not automatic. Judges don't go, okay, yeah, we'll just keep it moving on
Right.
until you're ready.
I'm aware of that.
Judges are used to balancing the interests. The prosecutor can say, Your Honor, can we please keep moving on? The victim wants this case wrapped up.
Yeah, you can say I need a new lawyer once, maybe twice, but the third time a judge is going to say,
Right.
wait a minute, you go with the lawyer you got her, we're going to go anyhow.
Right. So judges are used to doing that balancing act. They do it all the time already.
Okay, well, very good. Well, we already up on our first break?
Yeah,
Man, time
time
goes
flies,
fast here.
and we've got a lot of road to cover.
Dangerous. We got a long way to go. We're going to talk about who was Marsy and the national implications, the national effort that's being made here, and the vast amounts of funding that are available to try and push this through. And by the way, folks, we do hope you'll call in and participate in our show as we do every week. It's 640-3091. You want to call in and talk with us or with Jeannie Haruska?
Yeah, are you a victim that thinks that we need to bring this into our Constitution?
Particularly if you want to challenge this and say, yeah, we need this in our Constitution, please give us a call, and we'll be right back after a very short break. Hello, everybody out there. This is the progress report for this Wednesday, April 18th, when the winter is going to end.
Maybe tomorrow.
Tonight or something. Jeez, unbelievable. But anyhow, if you're just joining us, the issue for tonight is the effort to have a set of victims' rights enshrined in the New Hampshire Constitution. The effort is called Marsy's Law, but it won't be a law. It'll be a constitutional amendment if the backers have their way. And we are very pleased to have with us the policy director for the American Civil Liberties Union in New Hampshire, Jeannie Hruska, who's been here for a while and has had an interesting background, but she is very articulate and knowledgeable on this subject, and that's what we're talking about. So we've talked a bit about Marsy's Law, but maybe we ought to know, who is Marsy?
Good question. So Marsy refers to Marsy Nichols, who was a young woman in California who was killed in a tragic crime back in the early 2000s. And her brother, by the name of Henry Nichols, launched the Marsy's Law campaign, naming it after her. The person who killed her, her family, my understanding is her family wasn't notified when he was released, and so he came upon them in a store. They didn't know that he was out of jail, and so based on that whole experience, Henry Nichols has launched this Marsy's Law campaign to try and enshrine this very specific set of victims' rights in state constitutions. Currently, there are 5 states that have this Marsy's Law formula in their constitution.
Oh, I thought it was more than that.
So 35 states have victims' rights in their constitution, of some variation in the language. Only 5 states use Marsy's Law to do it.
And that's the law we're being presented with here
Right.
in New Hampshire.
So 30
The
states.
same one that's in these other 5 states.
Right. So 30 states have some reference to victims' rights in their constitution, but a lot of them do it with a sentence or two. It's Marsy's Law, if you look at it, is half a page. It's significantly longer than what a lot of states use.
Are you able to, I don't want to put too much of a burden on you, but is it possible to enumerate the specific rights? You know, we talked about a couple, you know, the right to a speedy conclusion of the matter. I assume there's some right to be notified when the custody of the defendant or potential defendant changes. Could you enumerate what?
I'm not going to be able to do them in order.
Fair enough, but I understand it's a long,
Yeah.
long passage. There may be a lot, but can you hit the highlights?
So right to be notified is a big one. The right to be heard.
Notified of all significant stages of the proceeding.
Right. The right to be heard at certain proceedings, the right to full and timely restitution, the right to reasonable protection from the accused throughout the criminal justice process, the right to refuse unnecessary depositions and interviews, the right to confer with the prosecutor of the state. I'm sure I'm missing a couple, but that's a lot of them.
Well, that's a lot of points, and the reason I wanted to do that was I wanted to kind of line that up with what we currently have here in New Hampshire. We don't have that enshrined in our very old Constitution, but we do have a Victims' Bill of Rights, as I understand it. And if I could certainly be mistaken, please correct me, but I thought it picked up most of those things.
It does. We have a very comprehensive Victims' Bill of Rights statute that was enacted in 1991, and it actually includes a number of rights that are not in Marsy's Law, which makes sense because the Marsy's Law formula was not written for New Hampshire. It's based off of a national model law, so it was written without any reference or consideration for our Victims' Bill of Rights statute. So our statute is very comprehensive. It is enforceable. It is mandatory upon the state to enforce it, and it's enforced across the state on a daily basis.
That was my next question. Do they actually use it? Does it actually have
Yes.
impact in the day-to-day matters of people who are in the court system?
Yeah, if you talk to county attorneys, they'll tell you they enforce the statute on a regular basis. Victims are notified, they're conferred with. So, yes, absolutely. In fact, a number of questions were posed to the Attorney General's office today about different provisions of Marsy's Law, and a lot of the answers were, this is how we do it now. We currently talk to victims.
Which raises the whole issue of, do we need this in the Constitution, right?
Well, to that, though, I mean, that law was enacted in '91. It could be repealed tomorrow.
In theory,
Doesn't the enshrining in the Constitution kind of give it more longevity, much harder to repeal a constitutional provision than a statute?
That's true with any statute, but what I would know is if you sat through the committee hearings that are going on in the State House and the executive session today, you hear that there isn't a single representative that is not 100% supportive of victims' rights. This is not about who does and does not support victims' rights. This is about the merits of the specific language on the page. Nobody is proposing revoking the victims' rights statute. Instead, what you've heard is a number of people who oppose the language in Marcy's law have said, let's reinforce this statute. If there are any problems with our statute, let's fix it. So there's a lot of commitment to our statute. I don't think anybody, I would be shocked if there was a single representative who was looking at watering down or removing our victims' rights statute.
And maybe it needs to be enhanced in some ways, like we have a victim's advocate. Maybe that person is kind of overwhelmed. Maybe we need to put more resources into that type of advocacy on behalf of victims.
Well, that kind of bill would certainly have more of an impact on the ground than a theoretical constitutional amendment that just, basically pays lip service. Now, what about the argument that, but sometimes, something will happen and a victim won't get notified, or, sometimes the system doesn't work the way it's supposed to?
We heard that. We heard a number of people testify of cases where they weren't properly notified. But I think the issue there is that a problem in law, or is that a problem of practice? Constitutional amendments, for instance, are not self-enforcing. Just because you put something in the Constitution does not mandate that it's going to get enforced 100% of the time.
Look at the Claremont case, right?
Or what I would
Look at the Soviet Union Constitution, for example.
Yeah, or what I know is if our Constitution was self-enforcing, the American Civil Liberties Union would not need to exist. But we exist
Good point.
because U.S. constitutional rights are violated all the time. So when we cite cases where a victim was not properly notified, it's really, I question whether it's because the law is insufficient or whether it's because resources are insufficient. Our county budgets are incredibly strapped right now. And so oftentimes it's just
look
that.
at the state budget, too.
Yeah, we don't have enough
Or the
victims
cities.
advocates. But again, that's not a legal issue, that's a resource issue.
That takes me to another question I wanted to ask about this. I understand in one state, I don't know if it's South Dakota, maybe if I tell what I'm about to say, it'll remind you, you'll know better than I. But they did adopt the amendment to their constitution, and now they find themselves needing to go back because of the costs involved were much, much more impactful on the county budgets or the judicial system budgets than they expected. So now that they have the problem of having to pass a fix to that, are you aware of that?
Yeah, it was South Dakota that you're referring to, and it's been a problem because the language is so expansive and ambiguous. States don't really know what the impact will be until they pass it. And that's what South Dakota did. They passed this, and it had wide-ranging repercussions that they weren't anticipating, including costs. And a constitutional amendment, unlike a statute, cannot easily be fixed once passed. Right? Statutes are updated regularly. To fix a constitutional amendment, even if it's just a word or two, requires passing a whole new constitutional amendment. So you have to go back through the legislature.
Supermajorities in both houses.
both houses.
And then out to
Exactly.
elect again.
Exactly.
And then get 2/3 of the voters. It ain't easy, that's right. We used to have constitutional conventions every 10 years. You remember that, Mike?
I do remember when they...
And we don't do it anymore, and I'm sorry about that. I think, we're too reverential for our constitutions and not active enough in bringing them up to date. But this is not the way to bring our Constitution up to date. I tend to agree with that. The advocates for Marcy's Law, they tend to cite particular example of cases where they feel it would have made a difference. One I've heard mentioned is Lizzie Marriott. You familiar with that case? A horrible thing. They never found the body, and there was a real issue about protecting her own privacy as regard her own sexual history. And a lot of people felt that there was an abuse of the victim there, although she deceased, so she couldn't speak for herself. Can you talk about that in relation to Marcy's Law, and whether that would have made any difference, or, whether there was something there that needed to be fixed?
I would note two things with the Marriott case. We do think that the court made a mistake originally in thinking that the information could be disclosed about the victim. But we would note that the court rectified its mistake. The court went back through, reviewed its decision, and decided to seal the information pertaining to the victim's past. The ACLU actually filed an amicus brief in support of the victim's family in that case, supporting the notion that the victim's information should be withheld. And it was in the end. The courts came to the right conclusion. So again, even without Marcy's Law, the court came to the right conclusion in the end. Also, the legislature responded to that case. The legislature passed a bill last session specifically responding to the Marriott case.
Oh, I don't remember that.
And that's the
Which I should.
benefit of statutory language, is it's easy to kind of
Can
fix.
react.
We can react. If there's problems with Marcy's Law, if there's problems with a constitutional amendment, it's hard to react. It's really hard to fix it, as we just
Oh, yeah.
discussed.
See, Citizens United, for one example, but I'm not
Right.
going there. Yeah. Anyway.
Right, but if there's problems in our statute, we can fix them. And I think you've heard, today the committee voted 24-11 against Marcy's Law. But what you heard
Pretty
from
stunning, I think.
it was a pretty strong
Very,
vote.
very strong vote.
And I think what you heard from the 24 representatives who voted against it is a willingness to look at our statute. If there are problems with it, let's fix it. If we have a rape shield law, if there's problems with it, let's fix it. But the problems are not so bad that the only fix is a constitutional amendment. And the problems are not such that a constitutional amendment is necessarily the right solution.
Yeah.
Well, that brings me to another point about this law. You mentioned that it comes out of California. It's an initiative spearheaded by certainly, I'm not questioning his motives or integrity in any way, but a very motivated person who is, I think, probably trying to do the right thing and spread a good thing across the country. But the fact that it kind of comes into New Hampshire etched in stone exactly as it was somewhere else, without even the sensitivity that we already have a statutory framework, and that maybe it could be adapted to work with that statutory framework. Not to mention a lot of money behind it promoting this with the purple T-shirts, and I'm sure those other organizing funds. Is that the right way for New Hampshire to amend its constitution? I guess if you could just, I suspect I know where you're going to go, or at least what side of this you're going to be on. But as Bob said earlier, I'm trying to play devil's advocate in this.
Kind of weak than that.
Well, I
You got to be a little tougher here.
I have misgivings about this law. It's very hard for me to try to come around and try to champion it because I can't see a lot where we need to have it. But I'd like to at least address the points that are out there, and one of them being that this kind of came in on a parachute without any real sensitivity to where it was dropped in.
So I would actually quote the Attorney General here. He mentioned today that they have found references dating back to 1993 where the Attorney General's office back then suggested that we should have victims' rights somehow enshrined in the Constitution. And I think our response to that is, then why hasn't there been this organic effort to craft a New Hampshire-specific amendment? We crafted our Victims' Bill of Rights statute. The ACLU strongly supports the statute. It's got good language in it. So why haven't we been able to craft a New Hampshire-specific amendment if the Attorney General's office has supported it for decades now?
Really? This was the Attorney General himself that spoke on this?
Yeah, that mentioned that.
I found references to, I'd like to know what that really means.
That's a good question.
Was it campaign rhetoric in support of a potential governor? Who knows,
But it still asks the question of, if that's a desire in the state, then why haven't we pulled stakeholders together and figured out New Hampshire-specific language? It's national model law language, right? It was written with no particular state in mind. So it doesn't factor in our Victims' Bill of Rights statute. In fact, one of the distinctions that we keep pointing out for our own concerns is our Victims' Bill of Rights statute has specific language in it that says victims' rights shall be enforced to the extent they do not violate the constitutional rights of the defendant.
Yeah.
And that language was actually inserted at the request of the Attorney General in 1991. That language is New Hampshire specific, and there's a reason we put it in there. There's nothing like that in Marcy's law. There is no language in Marcy's law explicitly protecting the constitutional rights of the defendant, which kind of go back to one of the original conversations we had about defendants' rights versus victims' rights.
Yes, I brought this up at the meeting I went to at the New Hampshire Police Station on Monday, where some of the advocates for this law were there, including one of the major lobbyists. And they were saying, shouldn't victims' rights be the equivalent status as the rights of the criminally accused, the defendants?
Well, vis-a-vis the state, maybe they should.
No, I don't think so.
Vis-a-vis the state, Bob. Vis-a-vis the state, victims, cannot be incarcerated. That's the point I'm trying to make.
That's the point. I think we're agreeing, Mike. I guess I didn't say it. The defendant in a criminal trial stands to lose his or her liberty, a lot of money, and in even extreme cases, a life. The victim may have been grievously injured, but the victim of the crime as a result of the trial doesn't face any of those consequences. So,
may have already faced them, though. I mean, a murder victim.
They've been grievously injured, and they certainly should have the right to sue for damages, which they do. Tough to do because most oftentimes there's not much there to recover a judgment from, but they certainly have that right, and I certainly think that they should have the rights that are enshrined, as you've been saying, in our victims' statutory rights, but to elevate those rights to the same as the person who stands to lose treasure, liberty, and very often liberty, and even in extreme cases, life, seems to me misguided, because ultimately when it's said and done, the case is not Jane Smith versus John Doe, it's the state of New Hampshire, or in federal cases, the United States versus John Doe. And that's the way it is. You're really redressing an injury against the public at the cost of a damage to a particular individual or a few individuals.
Yeah, and I think what's important to note there is one of the cornerstones of our criminal justice system is the presumption of innocence. And as soon as you start pitting victims against defendants, which using the term equality, right, that we should have equal rights, really suggests that we're pitting them against each other, you start to infringe on the presumption of innocence because...
Which is tough enough to maintain as it is.
Let me ask a question. That kind of triggered something in my mind. We have a situation where we have a crime of violence, and we have a victim, and we have someone who's been apprehended for that, and they're in the trial process, and there's been no judgment yet, but yet when that individual who is innocent, when his status changes, when he posts bail, there's this affirmative obligation to notify the victim of that. The problem I have with it is no one's been adjudicated as a criminal yet. That person who has posted bail has the same legal status as the person who just bought a sandwich on the corner sandwich shop. But yet that person, there's this legal obligation of the state to single that person out and do something about their location and provide that to somebody else. I'm obviously not prepared for that question because it just popped into my head, but can you talk a little bit about that, the idea that we're dealing with two innocent people at a certain phase of this?
No, I think that's a good point. One of the specific rights where I think that issue has come up is under Marcy's law, victims would have the right to reasonable protection against the accused. The only reason to give somebody protection is if that person is guilty, right? I only need protection from you if you're guilty of harming me, but you haven't been proven guilty yet. But by giving me a right of reasonable protection against you before you've been convicted, I'm assuming your guilt. I'm assuming that you're dangerous.
And yet we have to acknowledge there are people whose guilt has not been established that could be dangerous to victims.
Right, and we have laws that handle that, right? You can get restraining orders. The court system has ways of dealing with that. And
with a lower threshold below the reasonable doubt threshold.
Right, but with an evidentiary standard.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the concern with the right to reasonable protection is there's no evidentiary standard required. The constitutional right would be automatic, and it would be enforced against somebody who has not been convicted.
Yeah. Yeah. So, one of the things that's intrigued me about this is just the enormous and well-funded effort to get this done. I mean, we get lots of great issues to deal with in New Hampshire, including other constitutional issues. It's very few that you see the kind of resources that has been made available. You just look at the list of lobbyists that have been lined up to support this. If it's this one individual in California and he's trying to do it because of his sisters being brutally murdered, hard to feel bad about that, but still, to me, it's a little troubling that we're seeing these vast resources poured into this one thing, and it's part of the whole. I think that we have a tremendous problem with our whole political finance system, of course. And is that troubling to you?
Yeah, and I know it's troubling to representatives because they've talked to me about it. They said this feels very heavy-handed. This does not feel like something that is organic, that's coming from the people. It feels very top-down. And the money is disturbing to them. I mean, we have a volunteer legislature. Our system is designed around the notion that money shouldn't make law, right? Money shouldn't dictate policy. It's one of the things I love about New Hampshire, that we have a volunteer legislature.
Yeah, you can run for office pretty low cost if you
Yeah.
ever want to. Maybe you will. Who knows?
That's amazing. And having a really high, well-funded campaign kind of flies in the face of that.
Yeah, I'm just astonished at that the folks that have been lined up as lobbyists for this of both parties all over, and it's quite astounding. Yeah. So
Time for a second break?
time for a second break.
Regroup and have the last round of questions.
And again, folks, we hope you may be interested in pursuing this. We'd love to get
Yeah,
a
I'm
question.
surprised. I thought we'd get some calls.
I would
on this
hope
one.
some
Spinning
supporters of
paper.
Marcy's Law would call in and challenge us and our guests, because we pretty
doing
much
the best
agree.
I can. Help
he's
me out,
trying,
guys.
He's trying to be the devil's advocate, but he's not doing that well. Because
Sorry,
he really
Bob.
doesn't believe in it. But do call in 640-3091, and we'll be right back with the last segment of the progress report for this week. Hey, this is the progress report for Wednesday, April 18th. Still got to midnight to file your taxes due to a glitch on the computer down at the IRS. But I hope everybody out there that's watching us is taking care of that one way or another. I ended up with another extension. It's an awful habit. Every year I file an extension. But I pay. We pay.
As
We
I
pay.
said
My
earlier,
wife
I
and
don't know
pay.
if I could take the pressure. I got to get those. It's too much. It's too much.
I'm that way. I have to get them in about
I
a
was
month ahead of time.
Miserable. I can't do that.
Oh, you're
but
so
I
good, you people.
procrastinate,
You make me mad, you both of you. We are talking today about a attempt to have a amendment to the New Hampshire Constitution to put into the Constitution something called Marcy's Law, which would establish a victim's Bill of Rights, not just in statute, which we already have in New Hampshire, if you've been with us. Our guest, Jeannie Haruska, the policy director of the Civil Liberties Union, American Civil Liberties Union in New Hampshire, has made that very clear, and they're supportive of that. But to put this in the Constitution, and we've been dealing with the issues of why that might not be such a good idea, although Mike is trying to pretend he's thinking it might be a good idea.
Well, we got to have a discussion.
We got to have a
you know,
discussion, you
can't
know.
all be on
We
the same-
agree too much around here. Not enough drama. But in any event, that's what we're talking about. And I hope you've enjoyed what we've had to offer so far, and I don't want to go back over that. But there's a couple of things we have not yet covered. as we look at this vast effort, not only in New Hampshire but across the country, to push this thing into state constitutions in a lot of states. Apparently, so far, 5 states. I thought it was more than that, but there are other constitutional provisions in several other states that are not exactly this, but this exact thing has been pushed through in 5 states, according to Jeannie Huruska, who's with us today. And one thing that we have not talked about is the cost implications of this, and I'd like to ask you about that.
Sure. So that is an issue. It came up today from a number of representatives. And there's going to be costs in a number of ways. One is our current Victims' Bill of Rights statute does not apply to misdemeanors. Well, it applies to domestic violence misdemeanors, but not the full array of them.
And the proponents will say some misdemeanors are pretty serious crimes.
Right. But here's the cost implication. So you're looking at about 10,000 felonies charged a year in New Hampshire versus 44,000 misdemeanors. So you think of our county budgets that handle notification and working with victims on 10,000 felonies. Now add 44,000 misdemeanors where...
Yeah, but New Hampshire funds its system so lavishly, we should have no problem.
And taxpayers love paying increased property taxes, right? I think
Oh,
that's...
You all
everyone
gathered,
likes
I'm
that.
being facetious. We really do run bare bones budgets in just
Right.
about every aspect of the New Hampshire state government, and proudly do so. I mean, I think that's something New Hampshire kind of waves as a flag.
And I think what was interesting, the governor testified in support of this, and he said money was the old way of doing things. He really did not want money to be part of the conversation. And,
That really struck me, but go right ahead.
well, what I wanted to note on that is I can get that, right? That victims' rights, you should talk about the merits of the language. It shouldn't necessarily be that money makes the decision. But a number of coalitions against domestic and sexual violence in other states have opposed Marsy's Law because of the resource issue, because there are already such few resources for victims of domestic and sexual violence that if you add all of these misdemeanors, Marsy's Law would also have a broader definition of victim. So even with the existing 10,000 felonies, you would have a broader class of victims. You're now...
And what's an example of that? Someone who witnessed a loved one being assaulted or something like that?
The word
Family-
proximately harmed is included in Marsy's Law, which is...
That's tort language.
It's expansive. And so now you have a very limited set of resources that have to be spread out amongst a much larger group of victims. And that should be factored in, and that's why coalitions against domestic and sexual violence have opposed this in other states, because they're very concerned that resources for specifically victims of domestic and sexual violence will be diluted, and that we'll lose the focus on victims of really heinous crimes.
Or even more adequately funding victims advocates at the prosecutor's offices and the AG's office.
Right.
If the money is not an issue, as the governor says, why don't we up our game there?
Well, I wish you would make that argument with regard to education, mental health care, and a lot of other issues
Yeah,
that are giving us a
right.
hard time here in
Right.
New Hampshire.
Well, and I would just note, as a constitutional amendment, it brings no additional resources, right? It's
There's no
unlike...
funding mechanism built
There's
into
no
it.
fiscal note, there's no extra money coming. I know the Attorney General has said they'll work really hard to try and find additional resources.
They're
But
doing that today.
I think we would argue they should be looking for more resources with or without Marsy's Law. Like, we should be funding victims' resources as best we can, whether or not we have Marsy's Law.
Okay. Well, I just want to ask you if you have anything that we haven't covered here in regard to Marsy's Law that you'd like to bring up.
I think what I would know is that what has come up in a number of hearings is that there are ways to strengthen our system without Marsy's Law. For instance, we're about to have an automated notification system. That has really helped in other states where victims can sign up for email updates and whatnot, where they automatically get notified.
That should be low cost to do.
Well, once implemented, yeah, and a number of the people who testified in support of Marsy's Law, the real hiccup for them was the notification issue. There are ways that we can address that. CACR 22, Marsy's Law, again, doesn't come with any additional resources. There's no reason to think that simply adding this language to the Constitution is going to make the system any better when we already have an enforceable, mandatory, and comprehensive Victims' Bill of Rights.
You know, I think this vote we had in the Senate must have been the two committees. I mean, it must have been a double committee.
In the House, yeah, it's a joint committee,
Judiciary, and what was the other committee?
criminal justice.
Criminal Justice, 24 to 11. I mean, that's pretty stunning. That's way better than I was expecting.
What was the result in the Senate? Or has it?
I think it was passed unanimously in the Senate, wasn't it?
'Cause they have
No,
a
it
lo-
was 20-3 in the Senate.
Oh,
20 to
that's
3 in the
that's
Senate.
pretty overwhelming. So they
They
were in
are.
favor. The Senate's in favor of it, and
Yeah.
I understand there's a lot of senators that are sponsoring.
Well, the House does a better job on these things. You know, we get into it better. But
There's more people, more commitment.
I mean, I think that's critical because I think, frankly, I don't know what you think, Jeannie, but I think if this thing managed to get the 60% vote in the House as it did in the Senate, it probably would pass on the ballot because I'm told there's an enormous amount of money ready to go for trying to influence the voters with TV and, you know, all the bells and whistles and mailings and everything else. And so I
Plus
think
all their personal data from Facebook, so it can be properly targeted.
So I think this is the critical vote is going to be on the House floor, and this vote on the two committees, criminal justice and judiciary, is very strong, and you must feel very satisfied about that, given the overwhelming efforts that's being made with
But in the House,
well-funded
it can be
efforts.
turned over on the floor.
It can be, but that's a strong vote, and it's a good indication. And
Strong.
my
vote, but joint committee,
sense
too.
is, Jeannie, you can tell me that although it's not unanimous, the overwhelming majority of the lawyers in the legislature and the judiciary that's spoken up have been not in favor of this amendment. Is that correct?
Yeah, the lawyers on the Judiciary Committee, I think, have been particularly outspoken about
Both parties.
about the legal concerns involved.
Yeah.
I was really impressed with the Joint Committee's hearing on this. The hearing was 7.5 hours. They met today for about another 3 hours. They have been very deliberative on this, going through all the different issues. And so I think the vote today was a very informed vote. I think representatives were able to look at every single angle of this. And again, representatives spoke out and said, I support victims, I support our statute. If we can make it better, let's do it. But this is not about who does and does not support victims. This is about the language, and the language is very problematic.
You said that the governor and his attorney general are both supporting this and want this to come into our Constitution. What's the reasoning behind that? Is it a political calculus? Do you have any idea of what's motivating before the bill comes out? You know, his thinking on this, his support for this.
I would encourage you to talk to them. I know the governor has used the talking point that we need that victims should have equal rights to victims, that they should have a voice.
Superficially appealing, but the word is superficially.
I think our question would be, why does he think that that's not the case now? I mean, we have a Victims' Bill of Rights statute. If it's not being 100% enforced, we can work on that. We can address that. I have yet to see a problem presented that can only be solved with a constitutional amendment. And the equality argument that victims need equal rights to defendants is just a false argument. It's a misnomer. You're talking about two entirely different things.
Yeah. Very good. Well, I think this has been a really fine discussion. You've done an excellent job of presenting this to our viewers,
and to those out there who are in favor of this bill, I apologize for not doing a tremendous job advocating on your side of it. But
and we still would be welcome to take your calls. But
exactly.
I think we've got only a few minutes left, and I do have something else I might like to talk about, if it's okay with you, Jeannie. If you've got nothing more to add.
I turn it over to you.
Okay.
Thanks very much for coming on. This was an excellent discussion.
It was an excellent discussion, and I know you got here on short notice, and we really appreciate it. The governor's new energy strategy was announced today, the new 10-year energy strategy. And as you know, Mike, that's my committee agenda, science, technology.
Yeah, you've been involved in energy issues
I've
for a
talked
few
about
years.
that a lot, and I've been very involved in it, and I have a career going back decades on the issue of energy policy in the state of New Hampshire. And I have to say, I was so shocked and disappointed in this document that came out to replace the strategy done under Governor Lynch 10 years ago. It's not all bad, but it's real bad in large parts. They use this energy strategy to denounce the development of commuter rail. Think about that. That's against the new energy strategy. They endorsed, maintaining the Seabrook nuclear plant and suggesting it should count toward meeting our renewable energy objectives, without ever mentioning the fact that that nuclear plant, which is marginally economic at best, because the nuclear plants are closing all around us, even though they're built and paid for because they can't compete on operating costs, without ever mentioning the fact that every day that plant operates, it creates the most deadly poisons known to the history of man, high-level radioactive
Which are
waste.
stored on site.
Which is stored on site. They denounced, they came out against continuing to support the advancement of renewable energy in New Hampshire, on the ground.
So they're against it? Is
Yeah,
that what
well,
that
they're-
means? If you're not
they-
supporting
they-
it,
they're
if you're not
quote-
with us, you're against us, right?
They're, quote, against the subsidies for it, ignoring the fact that every energy system we have in the United States is heavily subsidized, starting with the nukes. Boy, are they subsidized. Starting with oil, the oil depletion allowance, intangible drilling costs. And God knows there's plenty of subsidies for coal extraction and all of that. I mean, I'm just appalled that this thing happened. And they said they developed this strategy by going around and listening to stakeholders here and there and everywhere. I think
Who was that? The oil companies and the
yeah, it turned out they were listening.
They
to
didn't listen to us.
They were listening to Americans for Prosperity and the Republicans that think the only way to deal with energy prices is to knock down the minuscule amounts that we use to support renewables and energy efficiency. So I may not be done with this, but
We'll have to do a show on it. We're out of time.
I'm going to do a show on this for sure. But
think we should.
I will be talking about it. The governor had a op-ed on this in the paper just a couple of days ago, praising it. And the only example he could cite of the damage for high energy costs in New Hampshire was Hitchener Manufacturing, which decided to expand. And he said, well, they decided to expand, but it was a harder decision than it should have been because
Oh, gee.
I mean, come on. Okay, well, that's that. That's my rant on energy today, which is, that's my hobby.
Come back in off the ledge, Bob. Come back in off the ledge. We'll do a show on this. and
I
we can-
also
we can
wanted to
explore
just
it.
let
It
people
deserves
know
all
that
that.
next week we're going to have, I think it's the first of our candidates that's running for the first congressional
No,
district.
we had Chris Pappas on earlier.
Oh, we did. We had Chris Pappas, our Manchester
In an
guy.
effort to get them all on here.
We're going to do it. There's 8 of them. And next week we're having Declan McEachern, who appeared before the Manchester City Dems this weekend, and I was quite impressed with him. I think maybe more than you were, Mike. But in any event, he's
We
going
can
to be on and talk about why he thinks should be our congressman here in Manchester and throughout the first district, which of course goes from here to the seacoast and up the state on the east side. And that's what we'll be looking forward to doing next week, and I think it'll be a great show too. And I hope next week we'll get some calls coming in and look forward to that. And I think the week after that I'm having on, oh God, well, I've already forgot.
We'll put it on the Facebook page.
Yeah, check out our Facebook page. The Progress Report has a Facebook page. I also put things up on my own Facebook page. Try to every week so you'll know what's coming up. And so I want to thank our guests for coming down on short notice
very
and
much.
doing a great
Thank you for
job.
having
Thank
me.
you very much. It was a pleasure having you here, and I'll look for you in the halls in Concord
Sounds good.
around the State House. Okay, folks, take care. Have a lovely evening. Go Red Sox.